Fellas, the final 3 pay-per-view cards of 2024 have already been revealed to us, so 2025, we have no idea who's going to be taking who on. We don't really know what's going to be in store for 2025, and the cards haven't been revealed, so I'm going to be building the first 5 UFC pay-per-view cards of 2025, of what I think the cards should be. I'm going to try and stack the cards, but keep it realistic as well, and we'll start off with the first pay-per-view card, which is going to be UFC 311 on January 18th. I think this should take place in the USA. Now, if we look at all the champions who could possibly headline this card, I'm going to eliminate Jones, Bilal Muhammad, Topuria, and Pantoja, because at the time these guys would have just fought, and even if they aren't the champion and there's a new champion, they would have also just fought. And I'm also going to eliminate Porton because, I mean, he's fought like 4 times in the past year, and even though he's a very active champion, I don't think he wants to return from UFC 307 immediately back at UFC 311, which leaves us with 3 champions. Now, out of these 3 champions, the one that I think needs to come back the most is Islam Makhachev. The dude's fought once in 2024, and he needs to come back quick. I think he needs to get a head start in 2025, fight on the first card, be the first headliner of 2025, and I think the contender he should take on is Arman Tsarukyan. I think this should be next. Hopefully this anti-bullying thing that Arman Tsarukyan's got going on has gone by this point, but yeah, Tsarukyan's definitely the next contender to knock out Beneil Dariush in a Fight Night main event and then go and fight Charles Oliveira, who's always been the top guy in the lightweight division, and beat him at UFC 300 when no other lightweight apart from Makhachev can really beat Oliveira. I think he's definitely cemented himself as the next contender to Islam Makhachev at 155, and what intrigues me about this matchup is if we look at the difficult matchups for Islam Makhachev, it tends to be strikers or an occasional guy like Charles Oliveira who has BJJ, but it don't really tend to be wrestlers, and Arman Tsarukyan's like the first proper wrestler we've seen face Islam Makhachev in a while, and on top of that, he's got the striking in the back pocket as well. I think it's a really intriguing fight because of the style of Arman Tsarukyan and how good he's looked, and the fact that he's been able to beat Charles Oliveira unlike any of the other contenders have been able to do so. Makhachev, Tsarukyan, kicking off 2025 for the first pay-per-view. I think it should be the headline of UFC 311, and then the co-main event, I want this to be a stacked card. I don't want no UFC 297 action kicking off the year with a terrible card. I want it to be a stacked card. So to start off the year with a bang, we need a good co-main event, and I want Justin Gaethje versus Dustin Poirier number 3. I think this will be a massive co-main event. I mean, this is probably one of the biggest non-title fights you can make in the UFC. They're both 1-1 against each other. Poirier beat Gaethje and finished him once. Gaethje finished Poirier once. They both just got finished in a 5-rounder in the fifth round of their most recent fights. I think this is a fight that I really want to see because you know what you're getting with this fight. 2 legends going at it, 2 guys that are going to go out there and scrap. You know what you're getting. The fight sells itself. You know exactly what you're getting. You know it's going to be a barn burner in the co-main event no matter what happens with the rest of the card. You know what you're getting. And I feel like these guys are in the same position. Listen, they're never going to become a champion again. They're never going to become a champion. They're probably, I mean, it's very unlikely that they ever fight for a belt again. They're both probably going to have a couple more fights and then retire. And I feel like they should only be in the UFC now for fun fights. And what better way than to settle the trilogy by making it a fun fight in the co-main event of the first pay-per-view of the year. So Justin Gaethje versus Dustin Poirier number 3. I would like to see that for the co-main event of this card. And then the featured fight, I said I'm going to stack it. I want the return of Yuri Prochazka, the former champion in the light heavyweight division. Obviously in his last fight just got knocked out by Alex Pereira pretty brutally as well. Got knocked out pretty much twice in the same fight. But for Yuri Prochazka, it's tough to say who he fights next. If we look at the state of the light heavyweight division, can't be Ankalaev because he's booked and then he's going to get a title shot. Jan Blachowicz is coming off a loss. He's already beat Rakic. He's already beat Uzdemir. Johnny Walker's coming off a loss. Carlos Ulber's booked with Volkan Uzdemir. So, in my opinion, who should face Prochazka next should be the winner of Azamat Murzakanov and Nikita Krylov. Murzakanov and Nikita Krylov are going to be taking each other on in, I think, the prelims of UFC 309. And that's a really interesting light heavyweight fight. And I think the winner would have done enough to secure a fight with Yuri because Azamat Murzakanov, if he beats Nikita Krylov, is going to be 15-0. He would have had wins over Alonzo Menifield and Nikita Krylov. And if Nikita Krylov wins, I mean, the dude is going to be on a 4-fight winning streak, and he's had wins over Ryan Spann, Volkan Uzdemir, Johnny Walker, and obviously Azamat Murzakanov. So I feel like the winner of that fight would have done enough to secure maybe a number 1 contender fight with Prochazka himself. And then the winner of this fight, especially if it's Murzakanov or Nikita Krylov, can then maybe fight for the belt in the light heavyweight division, whether Poaton's still there or not. So I think Yuri Prochazka, I know a lot of people want to see him against the likes of Jamal Hill and Jan Blachowicz, but I've got better fights for those guys. And I feel like for Yuri, he's been knocked out in 2 of his last 3. I'm not saying let's give him an easy fight because this isn't an easy fight, but maybe a little bit of a step down from the competition he's been having recently against the winner of up-and-coming Murzakanov or Nikita Krylov. And then for the next fight down on the card, I remember a couple of weeks ago, I watched Joaquin Buckley go out there and knock out Stephen Wonderboy Thompson in a very impressive fight, and then grab the mic and actually get an impressive call-out and redeem his last call-out. And he called out Usman, and that's exactly what I want on this card. Usman versus Buckley. It might be quite disrespectful to put Usman this low down on a pay-per-view card, considering he was a former champ. Well, he's a former champion. But I really want to see this fight, and I think if we are going to stack the card, let's see Usman return early in 2025 against Buckley. And I feel like there's so much in it for both of these guys. I mean, for Usman, if he does beat Buckley, he's beat a dude with a ton of hype. Buckley's a massive contender right now. If Usman beats him, he's beat a dude with a ton of hype. He's back in the winning column since 2021. It feels so long since Usman's last won, like 2021. Was when Usman last won. And he's back in the title picture. I'm not saying he gets a title shot if he beats Buckley, but he's definitely going to be back in the title picture if he does get a win over Buckley. And for Buckley, this is his biggest career fight so far. He's never had a fight as big as this. He's fighting one of the greatest welterweights of all time in Usman, a former champion, which is his biggest career fight yet. It's stylistically quite favourable as well, because he's got the grappling, but he's also got the striking as well, as he just showed against Wonderboy. And he gets a guaranteed title shot. If Buckley does get past Usman, he's going to be getting a title shot with no questions asked. So I feel like there's a lot in it for both of them. UFC 311, the fourth fight down on the card, Usman versus Buckley. I want to see that fight. And then the first fight kicking off the main card, I just want to see Brian Ortega versus Josh Emmett. I've heard a lot of people saying that Brian Ortega should move to 155, but I think he'd get murked in that division. This dude's struggling to beat guys in the featherweight division. I don't know why anyone thinks he'd have success in the lightweight division when he's already quite slow in this division. And he's won two out of his last 6 fights as well, coming off a loss to Diego Lopez. I want to see him against Josh Emmett, because Emmett, he's coming off that highlight reel brutal knockout over Bryce Mitchell, one of the most brutal knockouts last year, and we're yet to see him back in the octagon. We haven't seen him compete in 2024, so I want to see him as soon as possible, hopefully really early 2025, which is why I've put him on this pay-per-view card against Brian Ortega. Ortega versus Emmett, winner can maybe get a top 5 matchup, and that should make the UFC 311 main card look something like this. Makhachev versus Sarukian headlining it, big trilogy of Gaethje Poirier, Yuri versus Nikita Krylov or Alonzo Menifield, Usman returning against Buckley, and to kick off the main card we've got Brian Ortega and Josh Emmett. But I'm also going to have 3 extra prelim fights that I would like to see in the prelims of this card. The first one being Azu Almabayev versus Brandon Moreno, the loser of Brandon Moreno and Amir Albazi. Now, Azu Almabayev, he's won 4 times in the UFC, just beat number 7 ranked Mateus Nicolau, and I think he should have fight the loser of Moreno and Albazi. I mean, Moreno, if he loses to Albazi, he's going to be on a 3-fight losing streak, which is kind of crazy, to Pantoja Royval and Albazi. And if Albazi loses, he would have got a robbery win over Kai France, and he loses to Moreno. So either way, I think Moreno and Albazi do need to step down in the competition a little bit and fight down if they do lose. And I think Azu Almabayev, I think he's got like a record of like 21 or 22-3, who's just beaten Mateus Nicolau. I think he deserves a big fight against Ava Moreno and Albazi. So that's the first prelim. The second prelim is Ikram Aliskerov versus Andre Muniz. Now, I think this is booked in like some sort of fight night for February, but if we're going to do a pay-per-view with Islam Makhachev headlining it, why not get another Dagestani on it with Ikram Aliskerov? Ikram Aliskerov was a massive prospect in the UFC with 3 finishes, and then he obviously gets that short notice fight against one of the best in Whittaker, and then he gets finished. And Andre Muniz, he was also once a big prospect. He had a massive winning streak, and he was kind of like a submission prospect until he ran into Paul Craig and Brendan Allen, got finished in those fights, but he is back in the winning column again. I really like this matchup. It should be good to test Ikram Aliskerov's grappling against another really high-level grappler, and Muniz is still a tough fight. Obviously, he's not on the same level as Whittaker, but he's still a tough fight for him stylistically. That's another prelim fight I want to see, and then the final prelim fight is Temba Garimbo versus Li Jingliang. Temba Garimbo, guy who's really known for getting gifted a house by The Rock. He's on a 4-fight winning streak. He's 4-1 in the UFC, and he's just got a win over Nico Price. He doesn't look too promising, but I mean, he's in the winning column. He's on a 4-fight winning streak. Let's see him against Li Jingliang, who is on a 2-fight losing streak, got robbed against Daniel Rodriguez, but then he just got absolutely battered against Carlos Prates in his last fight. He needs to step down in competition. Temba Garimbo versus Li Jingliang, another fight that I'd like to see on the prelims of this card. So that is UFC 311, and then the next pay-per-view, UFC 312. This is going to be on February 20th, and it's been confirmed by the UFC. This is going to be in Australia. So if we look at the last 3 remaining champions, well, Makhachev's just fought, and out of these 2, who fits in an Australian headliner more? I mean, it's got to be Dricus du Plessis. He just fought in front of an Aussie crowd when he just faced Israel Adesanya and won the belt. He's familiar with that territory. Now, in terms of who he fights, I think there's one very clear fight which determines the opponent of Dricus du Plessis, and it's Robert Whittaker versus Khamzat Chimaev. Imagine if Whittaker can pull through Chimaev and we see the pay-per-view in Australia headlined by Robert Whittaker, a native, against Dricus du Plessis for the second time, a rematch for the belt. I think that would be massive, and even if Chimaev wins, I wouldn't mind seeing Dricus versus Chimaev. I know it's a bit of a random location considering neither of them are from Australia, but I still think it works. Obviously, the first time around, Dricus du Plessis got the win over Whittaker, got the finish in a massive upset, but since then, Whittaker's gone on a 2-fight winning streak, and if he can beat Chimaev, make that a 3-fight winning streak, I think this is a fight that I really like to see. I think Whittaker would have done enough to earn a rematch if he gets past undefeated Chimaev, so du Plessis versus Whittaker number 2 to headline the pay-per-view in Australia at UFC 312. And in the co-main event, the co-main event's arguably bigger than the main event because we're going to be seeing the return of Alexander Volkanovski. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be wanting to see Volkanovski get an immediate title shot when he returns, and don't get me wrong, he's definitely deserved it because he's arguably the greatest featherweight of all time, but I want to see Volkanovski. I don't know if I trust him to come back in the title picture immediately. I mean, he's been knocked out in his last 2 fights, and if he does get an immediate title shot, he's going to be facing either Topuria or Holloway, two of the most dangerous dudes in this division, and I feel like Diego Lopez has earned his shot. I want to see some fresh blood in the title picture in the 145 division. But for Volkanovski, I want to see him fight the winner of Movsar Evloev and Aljamain Sterling. I think the winner of Evloev and Sterling, if they do get a win over each other, whoever wins would have done enough to secure a #1 contender fight. And I think this is the perfect fight for Volkanovski because it's a danger-free matchup. Evloev has never finished anyone in his UFC career. Sterling's got terrible striking, and he's not really got the best finishing ability either. This is actually quite a favourable matchup for Alexander Volkanovski. And if Aljamain Sterling does beat Evloev, I think it's a big fight as well. You've got two former champions who obviously aren't champions anymore fighting each other for a chance to secure another title shot in the 145 division. So I think Alexander Volkanovski, a massive return, and give him a favourable matchup against the winner of Evloev and Sterling, who are going to be coming with hype if they get a win over each other. And then the featured fight, I remember JDM. This dude's been out for so long, man. UFC 299, I think he was, when he beat Gilbert Burns. Looked really good in that fight with Gilbert Burns, but he's kind of just been sat in the top 5 of the welterweight division for the past year, doing absolutely nothing. I want to see him return against Sean Brady. I think JDM versus Sean Brady, another #1 contender fight to determine who fights the winner of Shavkat and Bilal in the welterweight division, should be next. They're both coming off wins over Gilbert Burns. They're both in the top 5. Sean Brady's undefeated in the UFC. JDM's undefeated in the UFC, whereas Sean Brady, I mean, he's looked really good in the UFC. His only loss is to the current champion, Bilal Muhammad. These guys were scheduled before at UFC 290, but I feel like the rescheduling makes a lot more sense now that they're both in the top 5. They're both coming off a couple of wins. They've both got a lot of hype there. They're both one fight away from fighting for a belt. Sean Brady versus JDM, the return of both of them in the welterweight division. I think that makes the most sense. The return of JDM in Australia as well. We need it. And then next down on the card, let's look at some Aussie talent in the flyweight division. Well, the last time we saw two Aussies compete in the flyweight division against each other was when we saw Kai Kara France take on Steve Erceg. Well, it weren't two Aussies against each other, but you know what I mean. At UFC 305. Obviously, Kai Kara France went out there, finished Steve Erceg, looked really good. So I want to see Kai Kara France on this card. And I think there's a massive fight stared us right in the eyes in the flyweight division. Brandon Royval versus Kai Kara France 2. Again, another rematch. Another rematch, but more importantly, a fight that determines who fights for the belt next in the flyweight division. Another #1 contender fight. The first time around, Brandon Royval was able to finish Kai Kara France. But since their first fight, Kai Kara France, he went on a 3-fight winning streak. Then he lost to Moreno, had a robbery loss against Albazi, and obviously just beat Steve Erceg. And Royval's had a bit of an up-and-down career since the fight with what's his name, Kai Kara France. But in his past 2 fights, he's got an upset win over Brandon Moreno and an upset win recently over Tatsuro Taira. You could argue that Royval already deserves a title shot, but I feel like having Royval rematch Kai Kara France, this is such a good fight in the flyweight division. Absolute banger on the feet to determine who faces the winner of Pantoja and Kaya Sakura. I think makes a lot of sense. And then for the main card opener, let's see Taito Ivaza. Let's give him another chance. Let's give him another chance to be the main card order. I mean, it is in Australia. Let him open up the main card. Now, I don't really want to see him against any heavyweights that are ranked right now because the dude's on a 5-fight losing streak. 4 of them coming by way of finish. I think giving him anyone ranked right now is too risky for Taito Ivaza. So I want to see him against Waldo Cortez Acosta. Now, Waldo Cortez Acosta, this dude's a bit of a villain in the heavyweight division. He started mocking Andrei Arlovski. He beat him. He shut down the prospect of Rebelis Despain. So he's very hated in the heavyweight division. And, you know, it's another perfect heel matchup because he's going to be facing the fan favourite in Taito Ivaza. Good chance for Tuivasa to get back in the winning column in front of his home crowd in Australia. But this is what UFC 312 should be looking like, the main card. Dricus du Plessis versus Robert Whittaker as the pay-per-view headliner for the champion belt. Alexander Volkanovski returning against Aljamain Sterling or Evloev. JDM versus Sean Brady, #1 contender fight. Brandon Royval versus Kai Kara France, a #1 contender fight. And then the return of Tuivasa as he takes on Waldo Cortez Acosta. And then the 3 extra prelim fights that I've chosen for this card is Steve Erceg. I mean, you can't really do an Australian card without Steve Erceg. And I think he should be taking on the winner of Cody Durden and Joshua Van. Now, Cody Durden and Joshua Van are going to be taking each other on. And I I think the winner should take on Steve Erceg. Like I said, you can't have a pay-per-view in Australia without having Steve Erceg. The dude headlined a pay-per-view this year and he co-main evented a different one. To not have him on the card at all would be disrespectful, so at least let him headline the prelims against the winner of Jordan and Van. I mean, how good would that be? Imagine Joshua Van versus Steve Erceg. That'd be so good. The next fight I want to see is Junior Tafa versus Rebelis Despain. Remember back in WWE when they used to do those matchups where the loser retires? I think this should be that matchup. Rebelis Despain, Junior Tafa, loser retires. I mean, Rebelis Despain, he's looked terrible in his last two. His hype has completely been drained, and he's 1-2 in the UFC. And Junior Tafa, this dude he looked so bad in his last fight, and he's so lucky to still be in the UFC. I think the loser of this fight, cut them from the UFC while the winner progresses with their career. Junior Tafa, Rebelis Despain, it could actually be a good fight as well, because neither of them have to worry about the wrestling. Both of these guys are strikers. The boxing of Junior Tafa versus the taekwondo of Rebelis Despain. Two strikers going at it. Loser retires, or not retires, but gets cut from the UFC. And then the next prelim fight I want to see on this card is going to be Jake Matthews versus Zaleski DeSantos. I think this could just be a good fight in the welterweight division. Jake Matthews, he's an absolute veteran of the UFC. He's been in since 2014. Not been the most consistent, but he's coming off a win over Phil Rowe. And Zaleski DeSantos, he was once on a big winning streak, but again, he's kind of lost his tracks recently. Had a close fight with Renat Fakhretdinov and then lost to Randy Brown. So Jake Matthews, an Australian native, lets him against Zaleski DeSantos. And then the next pay-per-view is UFC 313. This is going to be in March. It doesn't have an official date, but it is going to be March. I think this should be the yearly Brazilian pay-per-view. The UFC visit Brazil yearly, and I think that is what UFC 313 should be. And when we think of pay-per-view headliners from Brazil, it's got to be Alex Pereira. I mean, he's one of the most active champions, and we need to see him early on in 2025, which is why I think he should be at UFC 313 in Brazil. And in terms of who he fights, I think there's one guy who he needs to fight, and it is Magomed Ankalaev. I know people want to see him go to heavyweight and face the likes of Aspinall and John Jones, but I feel like those guys should fight each other. And in the meantime, we see Alex Pereira versus Ankalaev. I mean, this is the fight in the light heavyweight division, right? This is the fight that we all want to see. This is kind of like Ankalaev's kind of like the boogeyman for Pereira in the light heavyweight division. It's just that one guy he needs to beat. The one guy we all want to see him fight. The one stylistic nightmare for Porton is Ankalaev. And if Porton can go out there and beat Ankalaev in Brazil, in my books, he's cleared out the light heavyweight division. He would have done enough in the light heavyweight division, and I won't mind him moving to heavyweight next. But to do that, he's got to get past Ankalaev, which is the big fight in the light heavyweight division. But to be fair, we have to see Ankalaev get past Rakic first at UFC 308. And then in the co-main event, I'm going to go up with another title fight, Merab. I don't really know if Merab's got enough star power to headline a pay-per-view by himself. So let's be safe. Let's let him co-main event this pay-per-view in Brazil. In terms of who he fights, Umar Magomedov, I mean, he's already got a fight booked against Song Yadong. And on top of that, I don't think he can fight in March because of Ramadan, so it's not going to be him. Sean O'Malley, I don't think the UFC are going to give him a rematch with Merab, and I understand why. He just got beaten by Merab. I don't really have any interest in that matchup right now. I think it should be the winner of PTN versus Davison Figueiredo against Merab in Brazil. Now, I'm hoping it isn't PTN because we've seen that fight before, and it was one of Merab's most dominating performances. And plus, if Figueiredo does win, I mean, he's a Brazilian representative. It makes sense to have him in Brazil fighting for a belt. So, Merab versus the winner of PTN versus Davison Figueiredo, I think is the next best thing you can do apart from Umar Magomedov. And already a pretty good card, 2 title fights. But what's better than 2 title fights? I think 3 title fights. And I think we need to see the return of Zhang Weili. She's actually one of the most inactive champions in the UFC right now. She fought once in 2023, once in 2024 when she faced Yan Xiaonan. She's not been booked as of yet. I think we need to see the return of Zhang Weili fairly early on in 2025. So I want to see her on UFC, in UFC Brazil if she's not going to be on like a Fight Night main event fighting for the belt. Now, the last time we saw 3 title fights on the same card, I'm pretty sure, well, at least undisputed, was Usman versus Masvidal 2 at UFC 261. So I think we need to make this a pretty good card. Now, in terms of who Weili fights next, it's pretty obvious. The winner of Virna Jandiroba and Tatiana Suarez. Tatiana Suarez and Virna Jandiroba are going to be taking each other on at UFC 310, and is officially a #1 contender fight for Zhang Weili. And that's who I think Weili should fight next. A women's belt on, finally getting the return of Zhang Weili against the rightful contender, whoever Jandiroba or Suarez, whoever wins that fight. So 3 title fights on one card. And then next, down on the card, I think we need to see a Brazilian contender take on somebody, which is why I want to see Caio Bralo come back. This dude, top 5 in the middleweight division, big contender coming from the Fighting Nerds gym, and obviously represents Brazil. I want to see him back. Now, in terms of who I want to see him fight next, I think there's a massive fight we can make between him and Anthony Hernandez. Hernandez is on a 6-fight winning streak. He absolutely chalked out and demolished Roman Kopylov, and in his most recent fight, he fought in a Fight Night main event against Michel Pereira. One of the most dominating performances I've seen in middleweight history. He absolutely butchered and mauled Michel Pereira. Didn't even look competitive in the slightest, like 3 10-8 rounds in a row. I think he's done enough to earn a top 5 matchup. I know people have been saying they want to see him versus Vettori. What does he get out of a fight with Vettori? If Vettori beats Hernandez, well done. A new contender, a new prospect in the middleweight division just lost to Marvin Vettori, the guy who's never going to be fighting for a belt again. Let's see 2 top contenders fight out, and I think the winner of Barallo and Hernandez can fight for a belt next. And I think stylistically, it's a really interesting matchup too. You've got Caio Brallo, who's one of the best striking contenders in the middleweight division, versus Hernandez, who's one of the best grappling contenders in the middleweight division. Caio Brallo, Anthony Hernandez, a massive, massive fight between 2 up-and-coming contenders, 2 guys who seem pretty much unstoppable, 2 guys who are on big winning streaks, and the winner of this fight can fight for a belt in the middleweight division after Robert Whittaker. And next down on the card, I want it to be Gelton Almeida versus Sergey Spivak. Now, this has already been booked for early 2025. I don't know the exact card, but I feel like since Gelton Almeida is from Brazil, you can use this as like a Brazilian main card opener. I actually kind of like this fight as well, because Gelton Almeida, we know him as being like the biggest grappling problem in the heavyweight division, but Spivak's got good grappling too. I feel like the only problem with Spivak is the execution, and he's coming off a submission win over Marcin Tybura as well. Almeida versus Spivak to kick off 2025, but to kick off the main card of UFC 313. So this is what the card should be looking like. 3 title fights, 3 undisputed belts on the same card for the first time in years. Pereira taking on Ankalaev in the light heavyweight fight we all want. Merab versus Davison Figueiredo, Zhang Weili versus the winner of Tatiana Suarez and Verna Jandiroba, Caio Brallo versus Hernandez, one of the best number 1 contender fights you can make in the UFC. And to open up the main card, Gelton Almeida versus Sergey Spivak. Now, the 3 extra prelim fights I want to see for this card is Johnny Walker versus Bogdan Guskov. That's a really good prelim fight. Now, this, again, is a fight that has been booked for 2025 at UFC 311, but I'm pretty, well, considering that this is a Brazilian card and Johnny Walker's from Brazil, I thought it would make sense for him to headline the prelims against Bogdan Guskov, which is a really good fight because Johnny Walker, he's on a bit of a losing streak. He lost to Ankalaev by knockout. He lost to Uzdemir by knockout. He needs a bit of a step down, taking on number 14th Bogdan Guskov, who's also lost to Volkan Uzdemir, but he's coming off 2 pretty good finishes and he's a prospect. So I think we see Johnny Walker versus Bogdan Guskov. The next fight on the prelims, I think we do Gene Silva versus Calvin Kattar. Gene Silva has to be one of the biggest prospects, not only in the featherweight division, but in the entirety of the UFC. So far, he's 4-0 in the 3-0 in the UFC, and he also won in the Contender Series with 3 straight finishes. Knocks out Charles Jourdain at UFC 303, and just 2 weeks later, butchers Drew Dober in a completely different weight class. I think he would have earned a shot at that top 15 to top 10 range of the featherweight division, and I think Calvin Kattar's the perfect fight. Calvin Kattar, he's won 1 time in his last 5 fights, and he has, well, previous to the recent domination loss he had to Sterling, he hadn't fought since 2022. I think he needs a bit of a step down, not necessarily in competition, but he can't be really fighting any of these contenders anymore. So I think we do Gene Silva, give him a crack at the rankings against Calvin Kattar, who's not really been looking good recently. And the third prelim fight I would do is Joanderson Brito versus Nathaniel Wood. If you've been on the channel, you've know that I keep hyping up Joanderson Brito. I keep saying that he's one of the best unranked featherweights right now, and he is. The dude was on a big winning streak with wins over the likes of Diego Lopez, Jack Shaw, Jonathan Pierce, and in this last fight he got robbed against William Gomez, which, you know, was hurt to see. And I think he should take on Nathaniel Wood. I feel like Nathaniel Wood always gets so close to getting a ranked fight, and then he fumbles it. He was on a 3-fight winning streak, fought Naimov, lost that. Now he's got a win over Daniel Pineda. I think we do Joanderson Brito versus Nathaniel Wood. The winner can potentially get a ranked fight from there. I think this is an absolute banger to make in the featherweight division. And then that next pay-per-view we've got is UFC 314 in April. I think this should be the UFC's yearly return to the UK. And if we're going to do an event in the UK, it's got to be headlined by none other than Tom Aspinall himself, the face of UK MMA right now. Now, in terms of who Aspinall faces, well, first and foremost, I think this should be for the undisputed belt. I'm hoping by this moment in time, Jones and Stipe would have both retired. Aspinall swoops in and claims the undisputed heavyweight champion, gets promoted to the undisputed heavyweight champion, so he can finally headline a pay-per-view in the UK. And in terms of who he headlines against, I think there's a big number 1 contender fight that's next. And it is Cyril Gane versus Alexander Volkov, who they're going to be competing on the same card as Jones and Stipe, I believe. And I think the winner of that fight should take on Tom Aspinall. If Alexander Volkov wins, I mean, I know Aspinall's beaten Volkov before in a pretty dominant performance, but since then, Volkov's been gone on a 4-fight winning streak, 3 of them coming by way of finish. Make that 5 if he can get past Cyril Gane as well. And if Cyril Gane can get past Volkov, he would have shut down Volkov's winning streak. And I feel like Aspinall versus Gane has been like a big fantasy fight we've been waiting for in the UFC for like ages now. So Aspinall Aspinall versus the winner of Garner versus Volkov to headline an event in the UK, in London, hopefully in normal times as well. We're not having to do no 5 a.m. action. So Aspinall versus Garner Volkov to headline this card. And I also think this is the perfect card to see the return of former champion Leon Edwards. Now, obviously, Leon Edwards, last time he fought in the UK, lost his belt to Bilal Muhammad. Let's have him in the co-main event of this card, where he's going to be getting the fan attention, where he's going to be the fan favourite. Why is he going to be the fan favourite? Because he's going to be taking on Ian Garry, the most hated dude in the UFC. I think there's a lot of reasons why this should be the next fight. They've got history. Leon Edwards kicked Ian Garry out of his gym, and I feel like Ian Garry, love him or hate him, he's done enough to earn a big fight in the welterweight division. He's undefeated in the UFC on a massive winning streak, and he's beaten 3 ranked fighters right now with Neil Magny, Jeff Neal, and MVP. And I think this is a big fight, and I don't understand why Edwards wouldn't take this fight. Like I said before, you get into core headline in the UK when you're a fan favourite. Everyone wants to see you win, and if you win this fight, you're probably going to be straight into the title talks. And on top of that, it's a very winnable fight for Leon Edwards. I think he beats Ian Garry and shuts down the undefeated streak of Ian Garry. So Edwards versus Garry, co-main event of this UK event. And then you can't really have a UK event without Paddy Pimblett, I feel like, nowadays. So we're going to be seeing Paddy Pimblett. Now, what is the biggest fight right now for Paddy Pimblett? It's got to be Renato Moicano. Moicano versus Paddy Pimblett for the featured fight of UFC 314 in the UK. This is such a good fight. You've got Pimblett, who's undefeated in the UFC, coming off a brutal finish over Bobby Green, where he upset everyone. Going to be taking on Renato Moicano, who's won 6 out of his last 7. He's on a 4-fight winning streak, and he just butchered Benmar St. Denis in enemy territory. Moicano versus Pimblett, I think the promotion for this fight would be amazing. I think this would be a massive fight, and the winner of this fight would have serious talks of fighting maybe in the top 5, or at least close to the top 5 of the lightweight division. It's a massive fight, the toughest fight they've both had in a while in the UK for Paddy Pimblett. Moicano versus Pimblett is the featured fight. And next, lower down on the card, I want to see somebody who's fought in the UK and co-headlined in the UK before. I'm talking about Rafael Fiziev. He obviously fought Gaethje in the UK. He's been out since September 2023, and he's in need of a return. And he's one of my favourites in the lightweight division. Like, he's one of the best strikers, undoubtedly, in the lightweight division. I want to see him return against Benil Dariush, who also has to return. Now, I understand that neither of these guys are from the UK. It's a bit of a random card to put it on, but you can kind of tie that in with the featured fight of the card, because maybe the winner of this fight's the winner of Moicano and Paddy Pimblett. But I think this is a good fight for both of these guys to return on. Both of these guys, they're coming off 2 losses. Obviously, Fiziev lost to Gaethje and got injured against Gamrot, and Dariush has been KO'd by Oliveira and Arman. They've both been out for months. To see them both come back on the same card, I think makes a lot of sense. And for the main card opener, I want to see Yair Rodriguez versus Arnold Allen. Now, obviously, Arnold Allen, last time he fought in the UK, and in his last fight, he got a win over Giga Chikadze. A pretty good win for him as well. And I think him versus Yair Rodriguez is a good fight to get Arnold Allen back into the top 5 where he belongs. And it's a really good matchup as well, because he's going to be facing another kickboxer in the UK, but it's a kickboxer that's much tougher than Giga Chikadze, a kickboxer that's in the top 5. And if Arnold Allen does beat Yair Rodriguez, that's when we can start talking about potential #1 contender fights for Arnold Allen. So I feel like we've got to have Arnold Allen in the UK, let him take on Yair Rodriguez. So this is what the UFC 314 card in the UK should look like. Tom Aspinall defending his undisputed belt against the winner of Garner and Volkov. Leon Edwards returning against Ian Garry. Moicano versus Pimblett in the lightweight division. Dariush and Fiziev both returning. And to open up the main card, we've got Yair Rodriguez versus Arnold Allen. Now, the 3 extra prelim fights I would make for UFC 314. The first one, Molly McCann versus Sam Hughes. Molly McCann, she needs a big step down in competition, but I think we've got to give her the benefit of the doubt and let her fight in the UK card now. Like I said, you've got to have Molly McCann. If she's going to fight anywhere, let it be in the UK. Now, in terms of why I'm picking her to fight Sam Hughes, it's because she needs to. She's lost 3 out of her last 4, and they were all dominant losses as well. And Sam Hughes is also pretty shit as well. She's also bottom of the barrel talent in the UFC. So Molly McCann versus Sam Hughes, probably the most winnable fight we've given Molly McCann in a while. Let her get a win in England, but it wouldn't surprise me if Sam Hughes somehow pulls off a win and outdogs Molly McCann and gets the win. So Molly McCann versus Sam Hughes is one of the prelims. The next prelim, Mick Parkin versus the loser of Romanov and Nascimento. Mick Parkin trains with Tom Aspinall, and he's looked really good in the heavyweight division so far. Came from the Contender Series, got a finish there, and since then have gone 4-0 in the UFC, with his most recent fight ending in a first-round knockout at UFC 304. And we know that Nascimento is going to be taking on Romanov at UFC. I think it's the Canada card. And I think the loser of that fight should have to face Mick Parkin. Mick Parkin, like I said, he's on a 5-fight... Well, he's undefeated, but he's on a 5-fight winning streak in the UFC. And I feel like in the heavyweight division, you can kind of afford to get away with more winning streaks because heavyweight's a lot less talented. And Romanov versus Nascimento, loser has to welcome Mick Parkin into the rankings in the UK. And for the final prelim, I want Sam Patterson versus Kevin Gisette. Sam Patterson, he's 3-1 in the UFC so far, 3 finishes, and he had a brutal loss to Yanai Lashmels. And he's going to be taking, well, I think he should take on Kevin Gisette, who was also on a 2-fight winning streak leading to the UFC, but then he's just recently lost to Brian Battle at UFC Paris. And I think both of these guys should fight. I think it'll be a good clash of styles, considering they're both good grapplers. They've both beaten Keith Crosby, Sam Patterson, Kevin Gisette, another prelim fight. And then the next pay-per-view I've got is going to be UFC 315 in May. This is going to be in the USA, and I think this should be the return of the Mac. This should be the McGregor card. Now, obviously, assuming that McGregor does return in 2025, this is going to be that card. Conor McGregor, he's got a lot of options in terms of who he fights. He could face the loser of Charles Oliveira and Michael Chandler, but a fight that's been floating around recently that I kind of agree with is Conor McGregor versus Dan Hooker. I really like this fight because Dan Hooker, I mean, it's probably, with all due respect to him, one of the easier matchups McGregor could have had it coming back to. Rather than facing somebody like Michael Chandler or Oliveira, I think Dan Hooker's probably the easiest out of the bunch, but at the same time, McGregor, this dude hasn't been looking good in his past couple of fights too, and he's been out for years. He's definitely not in the right frame of mind. Dan Hooker versus Conor McGregor would be a banger of a fight. They'd stand there and trade, they'd make it a war, and I just don't see that going the distance for, so that'll be a good fight for McGregor to come back to, a big pay-per-view main event, biggest fight of Dan Hooker's career. And I feel like Dan Hooker, if you're going to give the McGregor fight to anyone, Dan Hooker's a guy that definitely earns it, from, you know, just the fact that he's always in bang, he's in a 3-fight winning streak as well, and if McGregor wins this fight, he's going to be back in the top 5 of the lightweight division, which is crazy. So McGregor versus Dan Hooker, pay-per-view main event for the McGregor card. And then in the co-main event, a rescheduling that was also supposed to be on the old McGregor card, Jamal Hill versus Khalil Roundtree. I think Roundtree's kind of proved when he fought Alex Pereira that he deserves to be in the top 5 of the light heavyweight division, facing the likes of Jamal Hill. And considering that Jamal Hill, his performance against Poatan was way worse than Khalil Roundtree's performance against Poatan, I think we do Khalil Roundtree versus Jamal Hill to determine maybe who fights Yuri Prochazka next, and then from there we can get a title fight. Because I don't think the winner of that fight necessarily deserves an immediate title fight, but definitely a number 1 contender fight. Maybe if Yuri can beat, let's say, Krylov, and Hill can beat Roundtree, we do Hill versus Yuri to determine who fights for the belt next. Or Jamal Hill, Khalil Roundtree, really interesting fight in the light heavyweight division. A lot of people seem to think that Roundtree can get past Hill, so let's find out in the core main event of UFC 315. And then the featured fight of the card, the UFC love to put on prospects when McGregor's fighting, and I think a good prospect for this card could be Michael Morales. Now, I don't think there's any better fight for Michael Morales right now than MVP. MVP versus Michael Morales would be such a good fight. 2 high-level strikers. You've got MVP, who's definitely one of the best strikers, at least top 15, top 20 strikers in the UFC. And then you've got Michael Morales, who's a big striking prospect, undefeated in the UFC, just got his biggest win when he finished Neil Magny. MVP versus Michael Morales, you know what you're going to get. You know you're getting a high-level striking matchup. You don't have to worry about grappling. The winner can get a top 10 fight. Seeing this on the McGregor card when the whole world's watching, banger of a fight right there for Michael Morales and for MVP too. And then lower down on the card, this ain't so much about prospects, this is just about violence. And when there's one fighter when I think of violence, I mean, there's multiple. There's Justin Gaethje, there's Michael Chandler, but I also think of Sergey Pavlovich. Now, he's had a bit of a shaky past few fights, got finished by Tom Aspinall and battered by Alexander Volkov, and I think he needs a bit of a step down, which is why I want to see Rosenstrike versus Pavlovich. Pavlovich versus Rosenstrike I think is a good fight to make next for both of these guys, because for Pavlovich, Rosenstrike kind of fits in with the rest of Pavlovich's victims. He's one of these kind of good kickboxers, a bit brawly, a bit fat, a bit unathletic, but he is a good kickboxer, and he is coming off 2 wins as well over Shamil Gaziev and Tai Tuivasa, and I feel like it's a good fight for Pavlovich to get a good win on, and you just know that it ain't leaving the first round. Look at both of these guys' records and how many fights have ended by KO in both of their careers. There ain't no way this is going past the first or the second round. To put this on a McGregor card when the whole world is watching, Pavlovich, Rosenstrike, a good fight for Pavlovich to get back in the winning column, or a big opportunity for Rosenstrike to get in the top 5 of the heavyweight division, which I don't think anyone saw coming. Big fight there. And then to open up the main card, back to the whole prospect thing. The UFC love putting on prospects when McGregor's fighting, and one of the biggest prospects in the UFC right now is Peyton Talbot. In his last fight, he fought in UFC 303, which was supposed to be the McGregor card, and he knocked out Yanis Kamori in 20 seconds. And he called out a certain man, he called out Adrian Yanez, and I love this matchup. Adrian Yanez versus Peyton Talbot, I think, could be a pay-per-view main opener for the McGregor card. Adrian Yanez was once in the same position of Peyton Talbot. He was a big prospect. He was on a winning streak. He was this guy who was, getting a bunch of finishes until he got found out by Rob Font, got knocked knocked out by Rob Font and finished by Jonathan Martinez, and he is coming off a win in his last fight, and I think this is a really good fight, because if Peyton Talbot can get past Adrian Yanez, that's his biggest win in the UFC so far, and then we can even maybe start talking about ranked fighters for Peyton Talbot. And for Adrian Yanez, he can steal the hype of Peyton Talbot by beating him, so I think that's a great fight. So the main card of the McGregor card would look something like Conor McGregor versus Dan Hooker, or maybe the loser of Chandler and Oliveira, Jamal Hill versus Khalil Roundtree in the co-main event, Marlon Moraes versus MVP, Sergey Pavlovich versus Rosenstrike, and Adrian Yanez versus Peyton Talbot. Now, the extra prelim fights I'd like to see for this is Chris Curtis versus Joe Pyfer, again with the whole prospect thing. Joe Pyfer, big prospect in the middleweight division, one of the most brutal punchers as well in the middleweight division. I think this would be such a good fight to see. He's finished every fighter that he's beaten in the UFC, with his only loss being to Jack Hermansson, and he's going to be taking on Chris Curtis, who is probably one of the worst ranked fighters in the UFC. He's not a bad fighter, but I don't think he really has earned his ranking spot, considering that he's barely winning fights these days. He's also lost to Jack Hermansson, and stylistically, this is such a good fight. You've got Chris Curtis, who's an amazing boxer, Joe Pyfer, who's extremely powerful. Again, a fight that I just don't see going the distance to put on the McGregor card. The next fight down I want to see is Kyler Phillips versus Vinicius Oliveira. Now, Kyler Phillips, he was on a bit of an up-and-coming streak in the bantamweight division, and then he recently just lost to Rob Font, and he didn't really look good in that fight, and he needs a bit of a step down, doesn't really earn or deserve anyone in the top 10, and I think we should welcome Vinicius Oliveira. Now, you might be thinking that Vinicius Oliveira hasn't really done enough in the in this division to get a fight against Kyler Phillips, but the dude, I mean, you look at the fights that he's won in the UFC, he got one of the best knockouts so far this year with that insane flying knee, and he was just styling on Ricky Simon in his most recent fight when he beat Ricky Simon. So I think we see Vinicius Oliveira versus Kyler Phillips. And the next fight, Alex Caceres versus Darren Elkins. Why? Because it's two veterans taking each other on. Enough of the prospects. Let's see two veterans take each other on. Darren Elkins, tough as nails, always in a scrap, just beat Daniel Pineda. Alex Caceres has just got robbed against Sean Woodson, great striker, and it's a potential good win for him to get back on track with two veterans who have been in the UFC for, I think, over a decade now. Caceres versus Elkins, I think, should be next, but that is how I would build the first 5 pay-per-views of UFC in 2025. Let me know your thoughts on these pay-per-views. Let me know your thoughts on these cards. Do you agree with them or disagree? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.